The courtroom lights dimmed, casting long, uncertain shadows across the polished wooden floors. But the echoes of a decades-old melody still lingered in the air like ghosts refusing to be forgotten. It was a tune that had transcended generations, woven into the very fabric of rock history yet today. It floated not from an amplifier, but between the cold, impersonal walls of justice. Somewhere between dense legal jargon and the fading memory of electrifying guitar riffs, a battle was underway. A legend was not being celebrated, but scrutinized. Jimmy Page, the enigmatic and revered guitarist of Led Zeppelin, stood composed yet unmistakably burdened at the center of it all. His legacy built on strings and soundscapes that had defined an era was now on trial. Not on the concert stage, but beneath the austere gaze of the court. This wasn't merely about a song. It was a confrontation over memory, originality, and creative ownership. At stake was the soul of Dazed and Confused, one of rock's most haunting anthems. Now caught in a tug-of-war between homage and alleged appropriation. It was a case that questioned not only who created what, but how much of art truly belongs to its maker and how much to those who remember it. For fans across the world, it was always a signature Led Zeppelin track, slow-burning, psychedelic. Storm that captured the angst, rebellion, and disillusionment of a generation in flux. From the first ominous bass notes to the howling crescendos of Jimmy Page's bowed guitar. Dazed and Confused felt like a descent into emotional chaos. Fever dream etched into the grooves of vinyl and the memories of millions. It wasn't just a song, it was an experience, a visceral plunge into vulnerability, heartbreak, and fury. And yet, behind this iconic soundscape, behind the screaming amplifiers, the searing solos, and Robert Plant's wailing voicely, quieter, more contested truth. Because for some, this song wasn't entirely Led Zeppelin's creation. For some, it was a borrowed voice, an echo lifted from the shadows of another era. From the corners of a smoke-filled club where the spotlight rarely shined. That voice belonged to Jake Holmes, a soft-spoken, unassuming singer-songwriter whose own version of Dazed and Confused preceded Zeppelin's by nearly 2 years. Holmes wasn't a household name. He didn't tour with Massive Marshall. Stacks or set stages ablaze with pyrotechnics. In the mid-1960s, he was one of many American folk artists trying to find his place in a rapidly changing musical landscape. Amid the backdrop of Vietnam, civil rights protests, and the rise of counterculture, Holmes crafted songs that were thoughtful, introspective, and emotionally raw. One of those songs, written in 1967 and released on his debut album, The Above Ground Sound of Jake Holmes, was a moody, finger-picked track titled Dazed and Confused. Holmes's version was sparse, no thunderous drums. No electrified solos, just a haunting melody, a steady bass line, and lyrics that evoked heartbreak, betrayal, and existential unease. Been dazed and confused for so long, it's not true. He sang with a voice that was part lament, part accusation. The song had no studio gloss, no arena rock bravado. But it had atmosphere, and emotion, and honesty. When Jimmy Page, then the guitarist for the Yardbirds, heard Holmes perform the song live in New York in 1967, something clicked. Page was always a musical sponge absorbing sounds, riffs, and moods from every corner of the sonic spectrum. The Yardbirds soon began incorporating a version of Dazed and Confused into their live sets, though they significantly reworked aging blistering guitar solos, tempo shifts, and a more aggressive edge. The lyrics were altered, the structure transformed. But the emotional DNA remained eerily familiar by 1969, when Led Zeppelin released their self-titled debut album. Dazed and Confused was no longer just a live favorite, it was reborn as a studio monster. But this time, Jake Holmes's name was nowhere to be found. The songwriting credit listed only Jimmy Page. For years, the origins of the song remained a whispered controversy among music historians, obsessive fans, and those who cared to trace the lineage of musical ideas. Led Zeppelin, after all, had faced similar accusations before. From Whole Lotta Love with lyrical roots in Muddy Waters' You Need Love, to Stairway to Heaven, which some argued bore a striking resemblance to Spirit's Taurus. The band had developed a reputation not just for musical genius, but for muddy authorship. Still, most fans didn't care. For them, Zeppelin's versions of these songs were definitive, more powerful, more complex, more enduring. And in many ways, they were. The band had a gift for taking fragments of old blues, folk, and psychedelia, and transmuting them into something timeless. But for the original creators, often less famous, less wealthy, and less remembered, it was a different story. Jake Holmes didn't take legal action for decades, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of resignation. For a long time, he said little publicly about the song's evolution, but the silence eventually broke. In 2010, Holmes filed a lawsuit against Jimmy Page for copyright infringement, arguing that Dazed and Confused had been taken and transformed without permission or credit. The case never went to trial. It was settled out of court in 2012 under undisclosed terms. Holmes's name was never retroactively added to the Zeppelin release, but the legal filing reopened a broader debate about musical ownership, authorship, and artistic memory. What makes this story particularly compelling is not just the legal battle or the historical curiosity, it's the larger question it poses. Who owns an idea? In music, inspiration is fluid. Artists borrow, bend, and reinterpret constantly. Blues gave birth to rock. Folk bled into psychedelia, and jazz motifs echo through hip-hop. The line between influence and imitation is often murky, subjective, and fiercely debated. In Zeppelin's case, they often elevated the material they touched, turning it into something monumental. But does brilliance excuse omission? Does reinvention override acknowledgement? In an age where sampling is regulated, and digital platforms algorithmically track melodic similarities, the Holmes-Page saga feels both archaic and eerily prescient. It's a reminder of a time when the music industry was wilder, looser, and more prone to quiet erasures. But it also highlights the human side of art, the longing to be seen, remembered, and credited for one's voice, even if it's drowned out by louder ones. For Holmes, Dazed and Confused was never just a track, it was a piece of his emotional truth, crystallized in melody. For Page, it became a foundation stone in the mythology of Zeppelin, launching pad into realms of sonic chaos and virtuosity. That they both laid claim to the same song is both tragic and poetic. One gave it birth, the other gave it fire. In the end, the courtroom never decided the full truth of who owned the song. Legal settlements can silence accusations, but they don't always answer them. And perhaps, in music, no answer is ever final. Songs live on in the spaces between. Listeners' ears in the memories of first heartbreaks, road trips, basement concerts, and needle drops at midnight. Dazed and Confused belongs to the cultural ether, now shaped by Holmes, reimagined by Page, and ultimately carried forward by the generations who felt its ache. As for Jake Holmes, he continued making music, often in the background, composing jingles, writing thoughtful folk records, and carving out a quieter path. He never became a rock god, but his fingerprint remains, pressed invisibly into one of the most legendary tracks in rock history, and Jimmy Page. He remains a towering figure, a wizard of sound, whose legacy, while occasionally complicated, is undeniably brilliant. When he bows his guitar and summons thunder, fans still feel chills. But perhaps, somewhere in the background of that electric storm, Jake Holmes's melody still lingers soft, persistent, unresolved. Jake Holmes released his version in 1967. It was quieter, more stripped down, but it carried the same tortured soul. Jimmy Page, then playing with the Yardbirds, heard it, played it, lived it when Led Zeppelin formed. The song evolved louder, darker, sharper. And though Page claimed authorship, the bones of Holmes's creation were still there. For years, the debate simmered, often whispered in music circles, rarely reaching the public in full light. That changed when Holmes finally filed suit. He wasn't after headlines. He wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for acknowledgement, for truth, and for a piece of his song back. The legal battle that followed was as much about emotion as it was about law. In court, riffs became evidence. Lyrics became affidavits. Music, once a shared experience, was dissected like a crime scene. And at the center of it all was Jimmy Page, a man who built his mythos. On innovation now being accused of imitation, the trial was long. Both sides presented their history, their stories, their sounds. Fans took sides. Comment sections turned. Into battlegrounds, was Jimmy a thief or simply inspired? Was Holmes forgotten or just overshadowed? The lines blurred, the way they often do when legends and legacies collide. But then, unexpectedly, came the settlement. Quietly, privately, no cameras, no victory lap. A confidential agreement was reached. No public apology, no fiery statements. Just an ending, sealed with signatures rather than spotlights. Jimmy Page, now in his twilight years, seemed more interested in peace than pride. And Holmes at last had been heard. The story of Dazed and Confused is now part of rock history's messy, complicated tapestry. And perhaps that's what makes it even more powerful. Because music isn't clean. It's born from influence, from shared emotion, from echoes passed down and reinterpreted. For Jimmy Page, this wasn't just a lawsuit, was a reckoning. A reminder that every note played carries a story, and sometimes those stories are shared. In the end, there were no villains, only voices trying to be remembered, and now maybe they finally will be.